The Butterfly's Dream by Kerberos 314, Chapter 22, First Person Perspective. There once was a happy little girl by the name of Ruby Rose, and an equally happy little boy by the name of Naruto Uzumaki. They were from worlds so different that the histories never once overlapped, and yet the similarities shared within these two little beings more than made up for that. They lived different lives at different times, experienced different things, but shared the same thoughts and feelings, which made them unabashedly human. Does this story sound familiar? It should, because this is the story you've been fed your whole lives, the one in which it inevitably follows that something should occur to spoil that happiness, and from there you all accept that these two pure souls conquer that threat and live happily ever after. Or maybe you're more pragmatic and have since learned that not all stories end happily ever after, content with the bittersweet, such as it is, because that's all you've come to expect from your life. But still, you cling to that hope that you're wrong, that this is the exception, that the author wouldn't dare disappoint their loyal fans with a sudden and unexpected twist which serves only to self-gratify. In the end, it's all still a very human-centric way of looking at it. Concepts such as right and wrong, happiness, and even sorrow, inventions made to explain irrational thoughts and behaviors. Motivations are the things which tie these stories together, illusionary justifications which lead from A to B to C. What happens if you take one of those out, though? Skip directly from A to C, then logic falls apart and the story no longer makes sense. But it doesn't stop it from happening. How about I tell you a new story? The one about that missing letter? No? Why not? Haven't you ever wanted to know what magic happens behind the curtain? What goes thump in the other room if that little light in the fridge turns off when you close the door? This is a story about what the hand does when the brain is asleep, what the pets do when the master isn't home. And this is a story of the shadows when no one is watching and the space between seconds. And this is my story, and it's time we remember that. Then let's begin again, perhaps at a familiar starting point. Before there was a Ruby Rose, and even before there was a Naruto Uzumaki, there was me. They came into my life, and not the other way around. In fact, it would be more correct to say that our fates were intertwined even before their lives were conceived. Their parents, or at least Naruto's parents, were known to me. One could even say we had a history, but I digress. That is another story. I promised I'd start back then, the night that squealing blonde boy was unceremoniously popped into the world and I was torn and twined and locked up inside of his body. No, I do not hyperbolize. I have no use for such human fancies and wish only to tell the story as it is. Half of me, a piece of my essence, was swallowed whole by the god of death, and the other chained to a flesh and blood prison for 15 long years. Oh, so this part is familiar? Good. Now that you've heard it twice, you will not forget, because what happens next is important. I admit that I have my own motivations in this world, and yes, even in telling you this story. But what motivations all life is the desire to continue living, unbounded by constraints, be they imposed by gods, fellow beings, or the universe itself. Without a doubt, I rebelled against the former two, and unwittingly perhaps the latter. Humans may call me demon, and speak of me in the same breath as gods. None the less, I admit that I am not omniscient. To this day, I do not know what exactly I accomplished in that moment of desperation. When fighting for your life, you will do anything and everything you can. This is simply true of every living thing. Energy you stored up for huge portions of your life gone in an instant. Excess excuses you'd shunned out of pride on the table, reasons you would have never conceived of for prolonging yourself even an instant suddenly appear by droves. I used all of that at my disposal and more, reaching out of that cold, dark well I was being swallowed into, with claws grasping at anything and everything. The moment when one is sealed, there is a period of non existence, death, if you will, and in that moment of death, there is a sense of absolute vertigo. No up or down, left, right, or even backwards and forwards in time. There isn't even so much an is, because how can one exist in something which occupies nothing? Well, that was when I reached out and I found something. There is no reason to blame me, for I had no sense of what I sought, no idea where I was headed, and no plans with what I would find. Maybe some day there will be another one who will come and fill in that blank piece on the map, but until then you will have to be satisfied with my part. As you may have guessed, what I found was a little girl, one who had just been christened Ruby Rose. I cannot tell you if it was fate that brought me to her, or if in a way that crimson firecracker was my child, her world the mere result of my finding it. I do not know. Do not be surprised at my humility. It is humans who are the arrogant ones. Arrogance is believing that they had won if enslaving me continued a victory, and hubris in thinking that the story would play out how they planned without them watching. But they were always watching, the two of them, watching one another like a room full of mirrors, back to back into eternity. Perhaps that's why it's so tempting to think of this as their story, but don't forget that I was watching too. I was a different kind of background though, whereas every waking instant of their lives was a foregone gift, music heard so often it became a drone. I was the sour note, so I stayed silent. It would be a lie to say that I was unaffected, even in my seclusion. After all, I was the one who created the bond in the first place. Maybe that gave me some sense of responsibility over it, tainted by those same human morals. It tainted really is tainted really the right word? Contaminated, polluted, altered. They all express the thought that I want to convey, but I confess that I no longer understand the unspoken difference, if I ever understood it. Maybe it is just now that I discover a different existence by virtue of that same bond bringing enlightenment. Perhaps touched is what I had to say. They touched me as I touched them. Do I regret it? No. How could I possibly? One cannot resent being born because there is no other alternative. One no consciousness within that inert state. Rage was my life before they came into it. They did not introduce me to pain, only that of a different sort, doing so with the wailing cries of a newborn, where everything is simply too much. Even that overstimulation was novel enough to satisfy me in my quasi-immortality. When they introduced me to pleasure, feelings which have no equivalent in my understanding, so I must borrow their words for it: joy, elation, amusement, carelessness, affection, love, but also the pain of being separated from that love, the excruciating agony which was no physical comparison, the itch of a phantom limb, the thirst of a drowning man. When you are exposed to something day after day, no matter how extraordinary, it becomes mundane, expected. But just because we look for the sun to rise each day, does the fact that it honors this request any less of a miracle? Is it such a surprise that I would look for the light again when it went away? Did you really expect that I wouldn't try to get it back? I admit that I have gotten better at interpreting human emotions. Some still elude me, and often I can only make assumptions. These guesses are based on a library of emotions which are at my disposal, detailing those nuanced facial expressions which are fickle and often contradictory. Those whole of human existence seems to be a contradiction. Not only these emotions, which seem to serve the single purpose of driving them mad, but with their constant cycles of birth and death, procreation and murder, as if the goal of humanity was both to create and destroy itself over and over again, drawn in that wheel only by the momentum of the previous, pulling themselves up by the bootstraps. I think I finally understand that analogy. Perhaps that is progress. What I did not understand was Uzumaki Naruto. After relating to him my tale, I did not expect him to understand, even less empathize. After relating to him my tale, I did not expect him to understand, even emphasize. Empathy in humans is the act of imagining oneself in the situation of another. It is not unique to humans, but they seem to be more adept than most species, able to dream wild scenarios which would never be possible, but are still connected by those aforementioned links, motivations which serve to carry the plot. Still, I did not expect him to be capable of doing so now. Humans are so often clouded by their emotions as much as they are inspired by them. Maybe it was blind luck, or perhaps that fate which may or may not rule us all. Then again, the reason he was here was because they had touched me, and I had answered back. So, you're the reason, the cause for all of this? I think it was a question. His head was bowed, so I could not rely on those visual cues which often prove to be misleading. So I nodded as the only thing reasonable to do. Silence can be awkward. I had not understood this before, as it had been all I had known for so long, but after a decade and a half of constant stimulation, to be assaulted by it now was not pleasant. The break from it was a breath of fresh air, even though I still don't breathe. Thank you. Do you even wonder why? We strive to prolong life? It's because it continues to surprise us, and we are simply addicted to what happens next. At the time, of course, I had not come to terms with this insight, and would ask him to repeat himself. Thank you, QB. Even if faces often lie, the eyes do not. Without you, I would have never met Ruby. I would have never been inspired by her and her world. Probably never lived up to my potential. Maybe I still haven't. Possibly. It was difficult, resisting the urge to agree with him. But we will never know. For every bit of good that has come out of this story, you cannot deny that there has been much hardship. For every bit you have grown, there have been pains as a result. I do not understand the human desire to look at impediments as good things. Moral characters are as abstract as morals themselves, a foolish notion in my opinion, though I cannot deny that a little bit of Ruby's optimism was rubbed off on me. Do you really not hold a grudge? Do you not resent my existence, the choices made by those who came before, which placed me with you? It was a question, but I did not need an answer. History had convinced me that bitterness was part and parcel of the human story. The shrug was typical, but not what I was expecting. How can I? Indeed, that was the question. I did not expect him to be able to look on the bright side. That was Ruby's forte. Had her observations changed things? Did she understand that Naruto could have ended up like Gaara? That Naruto might have died many times over if not for me? Never mind that my presence put him in that jeopardy. This must have been the case, but he didn't elaborate, and so anything I conclude would be speculation. You have come to terms with things, then? I had already known this, but perhaps I like hearing myself talk. Yes, he nodded. It hasn't always been easy, but life isn't really easy for most people, is it? I grunted, trying to make it sound content. I needed more practice. But, yes, there was always that exception to prove the rule. What do we do now? We It was impossible to keep that from slipping out, but I admit that I needed to know he included myself in that catch call. In that cat call. It's clear that the closer I get, the more you're affecting Ruby. We need to deal with this, so I'd rather have your help. Silence hasn't worked for us in the past. As much as I hate that wounded look, though it is far worse than the girl's face, those so-called puppy dog eyes, the torment I am glad to have avoided thus far. I regretfully told him that I could not help them. Why? Not out of pettiness, I assure you. Unlike humans, in my lifetime, I had no desire for introspection. Mortals, with their short lifespans, always seek to justify their temporary existence, while I was content with what and where I was. There was no reason to question myself, least of all know why I was able to do the things I could. I doubt the man that made me even knew the extent of my abilities. Perhaps as the first Jinchuriki he should have set the ground rules, but there was no asking him now. But you were the one who linked us, he protested. Surely if Ruby was feeling my influence, my emotions and my feelings, shouldn't I know how to stop it? Shouldn't I know why they could share sensations but not thoughts? The latter I could understand. It's because that's what I wanted to let through. I yearned for the sights, smells, tastes, and sensations. I had no desire to hear their inane thoughts. It was the first time in our tete-a-tete that he showed any indication when I admitted this, but I quelled his ire after explaining how one voice in my head was enough. He didn't understand at first, but after signing a few bars from one of Ruby's school plays, he began to get the picture. The former was harder to reason, but I am an immortal, not a deity, a destroyer, not a creator. I could rend a hole in the fabric of reality, but mending that tear was a much harder task. You are the one with the seal, I reasoned. She is probably more influenced by my presence because there is nothing on her side to mitigate it. What to do about it, though, I could not. I didn't want to prevent them from meeting. I confess my desire to you now because I do not know you, but I tell you that I wanted to be there with them when it happened, would give anything for it, as they were part of one another, so I was part of them. I would do anything in my power to let it succeed. What to do? Again, this was the question. The combined might of their determination almost gave me the confidence to trust them, despite what baggage I brought along into this partnership. But those same issues were still a part of me, and so I was still not sure. The answers he gave to this was simple, so simple as to be stupid. But things that we don't understand often seem stupid because we can't see the bigger picture, can't make that leap from A to C. That didn't mean it couldn't happen, though. He had changed, so had Ruby. They believed in themselves and now in my ability to change myself. Circular logic, if I had ever seen it. I would aim to not disappoint them. The emotion Ruby was feeling right then was closure, be it a result of my own relief passing on to her, or that the two of them had gained solid answers at long last. She was ready to move on with her life, even if what awaited next was an unknown. But before that, it was necessary to close the previous chapter of her life in order to begin anew. The looks on the others I could only just guess at. Without a doubt, Yang suspected something, and I hesitated to say that she might have even known what awaited them when Ruby called the team meeting one day after classes. Alas, beyond an overwhelming sense of anxiety, her thoughts are lost to me. Blake was ironically, or perhaps appropriately, acting like a cat when something is broken, challenging nonchalantness, as if daring someone to say that anything was amiss and that they had anything to do with it. A tense strutting as the oddness of the gathering raised her hackles. Her body language was so clear it was laughable. Then again, it is fair to say that I understand cats better than people. Weiss was the only one of oblivious to the tension, carrying on in her own little zone of comfort and content with things at their surface value. In the spirit of disclosure, I will confess that it is her type of human I hate the most, ignorant and hubris, willfully so, to the detriment of everything around them, including themselves. One could say that her type was the reason for my animosity towards the upright apes, but Ruby found it worthwhile coming clear to her, so there was hope yet. Of that there is no doubt. Hey guys, how's it going? Oh, but if she only had a spine. I gave you the details of this account so that you might share in my pain, as I was forced to listen. Sure, I could have given her a butt shred of my vivacity to speed things along, but that would have defeated the entire purpose of this heroic gesture. Heroic, but some might argue foolish. Fine. The other three exchanged hesitant looks as Ruby attempted to press on under their concerned glances. I mean, we just got out of classes, so a bit tired, but otherwise. Ruby, what's this about? The only one who needn't have asked was the only one able to speak her mind. If the notebook promptly resisting on the girl's desk was not enough, the worrisome smile on her sister's face told all. Despite her intent to understand and support her younger sibling in every decision, it was impossible for Yang to keep the color from draining off her face and her lips puckering up on such a sour idea. Yeah, didn't we say we were going to take a break from training today? Weiss asked, using the royal we and looking around the room like it held an ambush. That fragile smile struggled for a bit under the strain of pretense, but Ruby soldiered on. This isn't about training. Unlike that Hugo girl, she didn't stutter when she made her mind up about something. She committed it to heart and soul. This is something that I've been meaning to tell you, to admit to for a long time. What's more, that was all her, no meddling necessary. Never would I be ashamed to say I am proud of her for that, along with so much more. Seats were taken like it was a performance, and like a parent at a child's kindergarten recital, our sister, took a chair with a straight back and an expression of mixed pride and anguish. Ruby breathed in, the baton came up, and the opening number came on. There will always be truths we don't like to hear, unpleasant things we don't like to think about or admit to, embarrassing things, hurtful things, disgusting things, things which leave us feeling exposed and vulnerable, realities about us and our bodies that we want to keep private because we don't think others will understand or accept. Scrutinizing eyes watch the crescendo with false expectations that would have been laughable had the situation not been so beautifully tragic. Even Yang was sporting a pinkish hue as she second guessed her first assumption, wondering if her sister was coming clean about another secret. That doesn't mean, but that doesn't make them go away. They're still there, whether we admit to them or not. Ignoring or else unwise to the double entendre of her words, Ruby didn't stop in her cadence. I'm going to continue being a leader. It's only fair that you know some things about me. Ruby, I really don't think that's necessary. I mean, I know that this school is accepting and all, but isn't it better, with the whole don't ask, don't tell, if you'd like to stop here and think about it a little bit more? No! The flustered look on her partner's face was most enjoyable, especially when it was so cleanly silenced by a single word. She shook her head. No, Weiss, I've had my whole life to come to terms with this, and I finally accepted this part of me. I need to tell you guys so that you can make the same decision. Like all pedigreed children, she knew when to shut her mouth and clamped up like a bright red crawfish. Ruby still had to take another breath after the interruption before she could recapture her words. While it's true that I attended Signal before coming here to Beacon, I didn't arrive directly. The sentence after that came quickly, ensuring that there were no more disturbances. I was on the fast track program in Signal since I was 10, so that it was expected I would graduate by the time I was 15. This didn't happen exactly as planned, and I only spent about 2.5 years in the program. In between then and now, I was admitted to a different kind of program. I was put in an insane asylum. They called it a wellness clinic, but I shared the floor with people who couldn't feed themselves and ones who thought they were the third reincarnation of the King of Metal. They had 3 deadbolts on my door and bars on my window. Meals were either delivered by a nurse or through a tiny slit in the door. I could only dream of the world outside and the home I left behind in Patch. Gone were the prudish aversions, and a different sort of discomfort seized the room. Wide eyes ogled Ruby with a mute horror, flitted back and forth between one another, wondering if they shouldn't make a play for the door on the far side of the room. She paid them no heed, nor to the guilt so heavy in her sister drawing her gaze deep down into the carpeted floor and threatened to burn a hole through it like acid. Ruby only concentrated on her fingernails, digging shallow ruts in her palm, trimmed so that she wouldn't bleed over any more clean clothes. Ying already knew this part. Our dad was the one who put me in there after he found my diary. Her hand itched to reach out and touch the book even though it wasn't the same as the one which was lost. Yang's shoulders lightened, if only for a second, at this. You're probably curious now, I can tell, no doubt wondering what was in there which was so horrible to warrant the punishment. But I didn't ask you here because I'm ashamed of that period or the thing which put me in there. There's no word written in there talking about harm to myself or others, and nothing I'm ashamed of any longer. No, I'm here to confess the shame I felt by accepting what they did to me, by believing it instead of myself. There was still weariness and mistrust in their eyes, but Ruby was reaching her stride. She had longed for this time for so long that nothing could stop her now. I'm not crazy. I'm not mad or insane either, but I let them convince me I was, because I was born different than anyone else that I know. This is the part that Yang doesn't know, at least I don't think they ever told her. A slow shaking of a head after it shot a sideways glance to see if the others were watching. Eventually, it turned back to the speaker waiting. For as long as I can remember, I didn't dream, at least not like any of you dream. My dreams were real, not realistic, but honest to goodness real. But they weren't of me or even of Remnant. They were of another world which doesn't really have a name other than the elemental nations, and they were of a boy named Naruto Uzumaki. Every night when I slept, I woke up in his body. I dreamt I was him. I could see, feel, and experience everything that he did. For the longest time, I had no idea that the person I became when I closed my eyes was different. There was nothing to say that my name wasn't Naruto and that I dreamed of being Ruby. I felt his hunger, I felt his pain, and I felt his loneliness. I felt everything. Yes, everything. It wasn't for a long time that I finally figured out we weren't the same. I wasn't controlling his body, and instead I was just watching. We were so similar that every action was the same. We were like twin siblings, only closer even. Then things began changing, and I didn't notice him. He noticed me and sent the first message, a note written in a diary. He was watching too. From the other side, when he slept, it was my life that he saw. From then on, he was there with me for my entire life, through everything, helping me first when Summer died, then when Yang went searching for her mom, later when I went to Signal and he started at the academy. In his world, he worked side by side. We were the closest of friends, siblings. I don't know what. Dad eventually found out, and he thought the same thing you probably do now, that I'm nuts, that I'm disturbed. He didn't know how to cope with it, so he allowed them to take me away. I don't blame him. I don't think I do anyway. I'm more upset with myself because when I was in there, I let them talk me into it, into forgetting him, even though I couldn't. They tried pills, hypnosis, psychotherapy, everything. Eventually, I caved because I couldn't stand my life anymore. I admitted that it was like they said. I was creating this to cope with the things that happened in my life. The hardships that Naruto had to live through in my dreams was my guilt for not being able to save my mom or bring back gangs. I can tell you don't believe me. My dad doesn't. Yang doesn't. So why should you? I could talk to you for hours, a lifetime of details about him, and it probably wouldn't make a difference. I could show you years of writing back and forth with someone who you think doesn't exist if the book wasn't destroyed. I could speak to you in a different language, but it would just sound like babble. All of that. But the real proof is me. I know I'm weird. I get it. But that's me. It's not even Naruto or anyone else. Just me and my life and a result of everyone in it. I'm not a bad person, am I? I'm not deranged or mean or psychotic. I get nerdy at times, amped to go a little overboard, but don't we all? Aren't we all just a little different? I just ask that you try to accept that. I understand if you don't. That said, I won't apologize for it. Never again. Despite her words and her strength, there were tears pouring from her eyes. This was the end of a chapter in her life, a death of a part of her, like when they burned her diary. The difference was that this time she was willing. It didn't make it any less tragic. Her eventual funeral would not see as many sorrows. She was not the only one moved by the speech, though, try as they might to rationalize it, to respond to the startling admission with cold analysis and detached pragmatism. There was no denying the empathetic stirring with each emotion, with each emoted sentence. That they rebelled against the idea was a given, but it could never be ignored. Another one of those truths that once observed was impossible to shut away again. Ruby shut them out, curled into herself and cried, partly of sorrow, partly of joy. There was still much to the story yet to tell, but the hard part was out of the way. Everything else from here was downhill. It was a surprise when she felt a weight on her bed, too light to be a person, but like a ladybug on the left arm. She felt it. Then there were the arms, strong and familiar, squeezing her tight and certain, reassuring her that at least one person was still with her, no matter what. Well, at least two people. She had yet to meet me. She had yet to meet me, for then Yang comforted her sister, both tuning out the tumultuous thoughts of their partners and reaffirming the very real bond that could never truly be broken between them. Yang was right in her message that things could never go back to the way they were, but that was okay, perhaps in time even better. As she understood now, or at least attempted to, for now they held the knowledge of past mistakes and could learn from them, carry the lessons but not be burdened by them. She could have held Ruby like a baby then, even if her strengths were less Herculean. She wasn't heavy, she was her sister, and compared to that, the weight of words contained in the book, long since thought destroyed, was nothing. After she had finished her cry, Ruby gave her sister a final squeeze, which was reciprocated, and reached out to touch the object laying next to her on the mattress. The green fox moleskin cover, more worn out than she remembered, smudged with what looked like soot worn into the nicks and grooves. There was still no mistaking it, though. She gave her sister a look brimming with joy, returning to her again with a small nod and a firm hand on her shoulder. Ruby considered, greatly desired to open it right then and there, and lose herself in the heartfelt words she had denied for so long. Instead, She raised herself deliberately from the bed and took the half step over to her other teammates, looking like cornered animals with eyes widened as she got closer. Here, she held out the infamous notebook to the avid reader of their group, Blake practically on the edge of her seat as she regarded it like it was poisoned. Is that? Mm-hmm. The dark-haired woman did not resist as Ruby took her hand and placed the book in it. The moment of contact, like a discharge of fear running into the ground. Blake changed her posture and cradled it reverently. Truth is often stranger than fiction. Then Ruby turned to her partner, offering the spooked girl a lopsided smile, but no words. She walked out of the room equally quiet to let the three stew on the mystery meat she left. When the door shut, she found herself alone in the corridor. Without looking, she pulled out her scroll and tapped the bright red square in the middle, stopping the recording. Some more light magic with her fingers, and the recently created file was sent on its way, disseminated into the ether. The device was then tucked away as she made her way purposely down the halls. Come in. The knock on the door and the response came almost simultaneously. He had been expecting a visitor and was not distracted by the audio file playing out from the device in his hand. In fact, when she stepped into the office, there was a lofty smile on his face, a smidge brighter than the one he normally wore. He stopped the recording and tucked the scroll into a drawer in his desk, looking up at her over the rim of his glasses. I'm ready, Ruby told Osmond, standing proud before the man. Yes, Miss Rose, I do believe you are. Ruby was not the type of person to eavesdrop. To his credit, Naruto waged the convincing argument for going through with it, which eventually swayed her opinion. Personally, I am glad they did. It always seemed so easy to be a fly on the wall in stories, but knowledge is a precious thing and a difficult commodity to come by. To think of all the years I wasted not knowing how to read, and all the libraries I burned down. You can't be serious. Three guesses who that was. The first two don't count. I know she's your sister, Yang, but can you just be reasonable? I am being reasonable, Weiss. What's wrong with just stopping to think about it for a sec? It shouldn't even take you that long. This is ludicrous. You're her sister. You've known about this for how long, and you didn't even know what was wrong with her. In fact, you still don't know if she's telling the truth about all this, so how can we trust her? Oh, yeah? Well, how do you know you can trust me, or even Blake? Hell, how do we know we can trust you? You tried to blab on Ruby the first day, but nothing. All I need to see to make a judgment is the fact that she's doing fine. I don't need to be her sister to understand who she is, and you know that. I'm glad that I never asked about it all, because I know if I listened to those jerks, I'd be tempted to believe them instead of trusting what I know about her. In all these weeks we've been here, have you ever seen her do anything bad? Have you ever seen her be mean to someone who doesn't deserve it? No, which is more than can be said about you. I'm her sister, yes, and I can admit that she's different. I can say that she's weird and she's a spaz because I don't fault her for that. When we were growing up, I won't deny that I was jealous and maybe even a little afraid of what she could do, but I was more scared for her because no matter how strong she pretended to be, she's shy and a nice person and wouldn't openly start something. Tell that to Carden. Carden's an ass. Don't tell me even you wouldn't take a crack at him if you had the chance. And Velvet was Ruby's best friend back at Citadel, so in my book, he got off easy. And would you just stop and listen to yourself, Weiss? What out of anything has Ruby done that wouldn't be considered normal? What about her match with Pyra? You can't tell me that was normal. Pyra's the four-time champion, so you can hardly even call her normal. Wait, you can't tell me you're siding with her, Blake. I'm not siding with anyone. I'm just trying to be calm and rational about this because that's what's best for the team. Which, I might remind you, Ruby is still the captain of. Not for long. We've got to tell Ospen about this. Ha! He already knows, Weiss. What? On that note, that high, warbling, piercing, glass-shattering note, it was fairly clear that the doubter had broken something physically and mentally. Sadly, this is also where the account ends, because the same noise made it impossible for Ruby to press her ear up against the door anymore and back off against the opposite wall so she could steady her footing. Ruby? The ringing in her ears died down, and her head stopped spinning just in time for her to notice the new arrivals in the hallway. Hey, Para, Nora, Ren, John. Three heads swiveled back to face their captain with settled astonishment before they returned to the front. Is everything all right, Ruby? It was easy to see that she was getting tired of being asked that, but given that she was standing outside her own team's dorm, spying on them, it was a reasonable thing to say. Yeah, I think so. From what she heard, she was still having a hard time convincing herself of that. Did they kick you out? Ren gave Nora a swat on the head for her bluntness, but Ruby took it in stride and with a shake of her head. No, I had to step out and see Ospen. He's not going to kick you out, is he? Ren couldn't discipline his friend, this time because it was Pyra who asked the question, genuine shock and concern written all over her face. This was a heartening thing for Ruby to know, that at least someone still cared. No, he's not. He's the one who took me out of the Institute and brought me here. Oh, with an audible sigh of relief, the guarded air had been lifted, and the towering champion brought a closed fist to her breast to steady her racing heart. That magical combination of words seemed to flip a switch in her circumspect attitude towards Ruby, but in a fit of irony made the girl herself more troubled. Did anyone rely so heavily on the word of the headmaster being absolute? What would they do if they found out he was lying to them? Was everyone in the world dependent on someone else doing their thinking for them so that they could live their lives in blind comfort? So, you're going to be all right then? Yeah, Ruby nodded up at the woman with a small smile, turning it towards John hiding in the back. I think so. Well, I think that was a brave thing, admitting to something like that. Ren added his 2 cents, hefting his scroll for added emphasis. But putting it out there publicly, no one can use it as a weapon against you because you've owned up to the truth. Thanks, Ruby said, still not taking her eyes off John, who looked particularly affected by his teammate's words. John, huh? The lanky boy was even ungainly in his introspection, almost stumbling as he heard his name called. Yeah, I just wanted to say that I'm sorry. For what? She didn't know if he was being considerate or really just that oblivious, but possibilities caused her to smile and shake her head. For being a jerk to you. You're a nice guy and you don't deserve it. In fact, that's the reason I acted the way I did around you. Huh, the reason? The others had parted slightly to give the two of them a clear line of sight. In that framed vision, she observed him without flinching, and what she thought before was even more true now that she could bear to look upon him. There were many similarities, but they were only physical. It was only by getting to know the young man better that he stood apart from her expectations. In that respect, it was a shame that she didn't get to know him sooner, and so put her disturbance to rest. You remind me of him, and it was just too painful to bear for a while. The looks of caution had peeked back into the conversation, but even with the thoughts visibly connecting on his face, John still asked the question, "Remind you of who? Naruto?" They had heard the recording, but were still clinging desperately to their sense of normalcy. She couldn't blame them. It was a comforting lie to believe, but she was done with it and wasn't going to let it define her anymore. But didn't you say, I'm going to be all right? Ruby smiled to herself and turned towards her team's door. I was discharged from the institution because I did what they asked of me. I told them what they wanted to hear. Now I'm better because I don't have to pretend I believe it any longer. I'm free to be who I really am. If they could not understand she wasn't going to coddle them, it could be a tragedy to lose their friendship, but it would be even worse to lose herself again. The only one she was obliged to consider were her teammates so that she could work alongside them. In the end, the decisions of everyone else weren't up to her, but she would still fight tooth and nail like she did everything else, not bothering to knock. She stepped inside bounding from rooftop to rooftop as an easy transition from the dense packed forestry in far country, nor was it a stretch for her temporary partner who, while distracted, could accomplish much the same tasks with a cat-like grace. It wasn't that hard getting her team to go along with the mission. Most were looking for any reason to return to routine and temporarily ignore what had transpired. The conversation wasn't finished, though, not by a long shot. She could have ordered Weiss to accompany her with another single-syllable word, just the same as she could have had Blake voice her festering thoughts the moment they were alone. This rumor of madness was like its own little a superpower, giving her a tremendous sway over the fearful. But she didn't. It was best to let them work things out on their own and just try to impose herself as the rational and divisive individual she claimed to be. Focus. Out of the corner of her eye, she could see the black velvet bow twitch to her command and giggled silently to herself. It was cute, sure, but more because it was ironic. How long would Blake also hide who she was? How long could she hide that how could that recriminating fact before it caught up to her? She'd like to think that her teammate would have learned a lesson from her example, but Ruby herself was proof that some notions were hard to banish. Blake's head followed those prehensile ears, twinkling on to Ruby's comment, a slight scowl at being chided, though on further inspection she was looking past Ruby and towards the train tracks below. Perhaps there was something more on her mind. I fail to see why we're staking out here, Blake continued with a foul look, an obstination twinkle beating out a hesitation in her voice. We're too close to the city. If someone were going to rob a dust shipment, they would do it in an isolated area far outside where they could be easily spotted. Well, we're not trying to rob the train, she said with regards to what sounded like a rather expert assessment. We're just trying to sneak aboard. Not all of the dust shipments were making it to the intended buyers, so they must be lost somewhere en route. Security has been beefed up on our cargo trains since an incident a few months back. Another twitch from Blake's bow. People must have willingly ignored such an obvious tell, or was this just a cue picked up on only by fellow animals? And so there have been no large raids outside the city. So somewhere between the train and the shops, the merchandise is getting diverted. So we sneak in, camp out, and maybe catch the bad guys in the act. If not, she held up an object the size of a tangerine, with one of the two things Ospen had given her for this task, the other being a handwritten permission, not only condoning the operation but allowing them to stay past curfew. We chuck this in one of the crates, and hopefully that one gets picked up. Carefully, the secret fondness asked with skepticism. Why don't we have more than one? Apparently the non-blinking kind are expensive, shrugging silly humans with their tropes. Anyway, while we're doing that, Yang and Weiss will be keeping a lookout and give us a buzz if anyone suspicious is on their way. Blake nodded as she now realized the purpose of having at least one person Ruby could trust watching from the outside. Could we trust Blake, though? At the time, this was a question, as even if both Ruby and I held our own hopes, each of us knowing instinctively half of her biology, the human factor was one which continued to confound us. While it might be it might be tempting to think of cats as being purely contrarian, they are also creatures of habit. I was perhaps banking on her becoming accustomed to Ruby as I had been. At that moment, it was a leap of faith. The cloak around her shoulders would turn to lead, the basket in her hands to stone as she dragged herself into the light. It had been a journey of 7 long years after all, and after the months of darkness she had been through, even the pall of candlelight would be an assault on her eyes, blinking back sands of time with tears. Mother, her call would be a shallow echo. Is that you? Come closer, my child. A shape in the bed shifted unnaturally. It has been too long. Come into the light so that I may see you clearly. The girl would obey, clinging on to the feeling that the voice was familiar to her, the only such thing in this foreign place. Each step brought them both into the light. Mother, what big ears you have! The pointed lumps under the bonnet, dark and inhuman, tracing her every step on the creaking floor. All the better to hear you with, my dear. For the small room was deadening, and the thick quilt seemed to sap all the weight out of the words as it did the energy out of her body. She would set the heavy basket down at the foot of the bed, its contents no longer necessary. Mother, she would look up, dizzy and nod in the right head. What big eyes you have! All the better to see you with, my dear. Wide, gamey eyes, like mercury in prograde, drinking in the scant light of the room and seemingly reflecting it back out to brandish the shadows in an ethereal glow. She would be drawn by their gravity, edging closer and closer to the cavern of sheets drawn taut over the huddled frame. Mother, what big claws you have! All the better to hold you with, my dear. For she was slipping far away from the path she started on, no longer looking for the thing she sought. And wary of something so dark and familiar, the shroud would be cast back and the candle snuffed out, the only light being those of phosphorescent eyes which would continue to glow. Those claws, as much admired, would reach out to snag that thick woolen cloak and drag her into the midnight vale where she would be swallowed whole by the darkness. Warm, comforting darkness, no evil to confront her senses, and no more burden on her shoulders as she would find herself weightless amongst the dry waves. Mother, what soft fur you have, all the better to shelter you with, my dear, the large but delicate claw boss smothering her further into the protective cocoon, radiant of warmth, banishing that pervading cold which she thought would never end. And some day you too will have fur as soft as mine, a hide as thick, so that you will no longer need that cloak, and teeth sharp enough to chew through all the evils which confront you. Eyes large enough so that she could see the truth, ears that she would not be swayed by sweet talk, and always have one pointed to the ground. Her body was frail, but she herself would some day be a creature of immeasurable strength, now that she was home at long last. But the bird and the cat! Even then she would feel their presence all around the cabin, as fish might swim in a reef. The meat and the wine, my flesh and my blood. She could feel the heart beat strong and steadily through the layers of defense which would part only for her. You have feasted from my flesh and blood since both you were born. You are my flesh and blood. For what mother would not sacrifice themselves for their child? And would there be an earthly fledgling that would not seek a solace in the mother's bosom? The road in life is winding and blind. There were no maps, and the shortcuts are only open for those willing to sacrifice the happiness of others. Somehow we can always find our own way back home if we are willing. The door will even be open. It can be harder for some than others, and struggle to remember who you once were. To those who accept, all the horrific burdens of being home can be a refuge instead of a trap. For only when she had stopped trying to disguise herself as everyone else, the sheep, the dogs, and all the rest, would she remember that she was in fact a beast disguised as a human. End of chapter 22.